In this special news analysis, we identify 4 themes from the recent Royal Commission Interim Report into financial services industry misconduct. Submissions in response to the interim report, which ran to 3 volumes and nearly 1,000 pages, closed in late October. The next round of hearings will be held in Sydney and Melbourne over the second half of November, with the final report due by 1 February 2019. In setting the scene, the interim report identified dishonesty and greed as the 2 main drivers behind the misconduct to date. Specifically, the Commission concluded that the pursuit of short-term profit had too often been prioritised at the expense of basic standards of honesty across the industry. The 4 areas we will examine are consumer lending, financial advice, SMEs, and regulation. According to KPMG Australia's Financial Services Law Team, key consumer lending issues identified by the report are the confusion of intermediary roles, communication with customers, and responsible lending practices. The key issues for the mortgage broking industry include the finding that value and volume-based remuneration for intermediaries has been an important contributor to misconduct. The Commission further noted that conversations between financial services entities and their customers are routinely treated as an opportunity to sell further products or services. Compounding this issue is the report finding that there is confusion about who mortgage brokers actually work for, and that the broker owes the borrower no duty larger than not to negotiate an unsuitable loan. The Commission was also unimpressed with industry reforms around responsible lending standards. It noted that the proposed changes to commission structure does not deal with the more basic problem of borrowers being encouraged to borrow more than they need. KPMG Australia said the sections of the interim report on financial advice contain some of the Commission's most consequential findings for the future of the Australian banking and financial services sector. On conflicts of interest, the report noted that the choice between interest and duty is too often resolved in favour of the advisor's self-interest. However, Commissioner Kenneth Hayne hinted that more legislation is unlikely to be the answer in this area. The law already requires entities to do all things necessary to ensure that the services they are licensed to provide are provided efficiently, honestly, and fairly. Much more often than not, the conduct now condemned was contrary to law. Passing some new law to say again, do not do that, would add an extra layer of legal complexity to an already complex regulatory regime. What would that gain? The interim report placed a heavy emphasis on how the industry had created the wrong incentives. According to KPMG, on this point the Commission appears to fully support ASIC's position that any exception to the ban on conflicted remuneration has the ability to create misaligned incentives which can lead to inappropriate advice. In its commentary on the vertical integration of financial product manufacture with financial product sale and advice, the Commission observed that the internal efficiency of the one-stop shop does not necessarily work for customers. Hayne questioned in the interim report whether structural change was necessary to unwind vertical integration. Should an intermediary be permitted to recommend to a consumer, provide personal financial advice to a consumer, or sell to a consumer any financial product manufactured by an entity of which the intermediary is an employee or authorized representative? The interim report followed several threads but found no specific need to add more regulation to the sector in relation to small business lending. However, KPMG noted that the Commission's commentary on SME lending questioned the fact that the responsible lending provisions of the National Consumer Credit Protection Act do not currently apply to lending for small business purposes. While the hardship, pre-contractual disclosure, price regulation, and enforcement provisions of the National Credit Code do not apply, the Commission found that the evidence and submissions provided to the Commission did not reveal any great appetite to change the legal framework. Australian Small Business and Family Enterprise Ombudsman Kate Carnell said additional regulation could have unintended consequences in tightening lending to small businesses even further. We agree that the application of the National Consumer Credit Protection Act should not apply to small businesses. Restricting lending or increasing the cost would not be good for the economy, she said. In its discussion of voluntary guarantees, KPMG added that the report had observed a disconnect between how the law and lenders treat third-party guarantors. This is instructive given the Commission's acknowledgement that most voluntary guarantors for SMEs are family members assisting their loved ones. Third-party guarantors draws into sharp focus the disconnect between how the law and lenders may treat third-party guarantors and the reality of the role played by many, if not most, guarantors of small business. Crucially, the Commission also evaluated the performance of regulators ASIC and APRA. The Commission highlighted ASIC's preference for negotiated outcomes over civil proceedings, observing that the regulator's enforcement approach to date has not had the desired deterrent effect. The interim report went on to question whether ASIC's approach was adequate in the face of industry misconduct. Little happened beyond apology from the entity, a drawn-out remediation program, and protracted negotiation with ASIC of a media release, an infringement notice, or an enforceable undertaking that acknowledged no more than that ASIC had reasonable concerns about the entity's conduct. In a speech following the release of the interim report, APRA Chairman Wayne Byers said the Royal Commission had suggested that regulators can and should do more to actively enforce standards of behaviour within the financial sector and punish those who breach them. Based on what has been revealed, that is a quite reasonable conclusion, he said. Consistent with prudential supervisors around the world, APRA has traditionally examined cases of poor conduct as an indicator of risk, but not a direct prudential risk in and of itself, unless it was likely to jeopardize the stability of the system or an individual institution. We will clearly need to reflect on that approach. Byers added that regulatory initiatives in the pipeline, such as accountability statements, remuneration restrictions, strengthened governance requirements, greater attention to organizational culture, and more forceful enforcement would drive change. In its analysis, Moody's Investors Services predicted that regulatory and compliance supervision will become more interventionist and more litigious, resulting in higher penalties than in the past. This could include significant penalties being recommended in the final report.